Hey, as we get going, here's our agenda for our hour together. We're in our welcome phase right now, and we'll find out who's here, and I'll introduce myself to you again and remind you of this virtual learning network and what the goals are for us. And then we'll get right into the meat of our webinar today, looking at our problem of practice with reaching all students. In order to address that question, we'll be looking at the Common Core shift of focus. We'll be taking a very quick glance at some differentiation ideas and then targeting two strategies that come from a book on Common Core essential strategies. And then we'll end up by just talking about how do we do today, how did the webinar work for you, and do you have any ideas for our next topic that we can address. So here we go. That's me, or at least a picture of me, in one of the classrooms I was helping out in. My name's Nanci Smith. I am a faculty member with ASCD, and I am part of the Common Core cadre as well as the differentiated instruction cadre. My area of expertise is mathematics, and that is what my doctorate is math education. I have taught high school primarily in the classroom. I did a research study on middle school students and how they learn for about 5 years, thanks to an NSF grant. And I've also taught at the university level. And these days I am a full-time consultant in the areas of mathematics, differentiated instruction, understanding by design, and curriculum and assessment. So that's a little bit about me and who this voice is that's coming across to you this hour. I'd love to know who's with us today. And so our first poll question, and if you have not been with us before, these will pop up on your screen, and you just click in one of the choices. I'm wondering what your main role is in education, and so let's see who's here with us today. Okay, here we go. 29% of you are math educators, and 29% of you are school administrators. We have 6% consultants and 35% others. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the next question, and that is, primarily, what grade or subjects are you responsible for? So I'm assuming that everybody is involved in math somehow, otherwise you wouldn't be attending today. So as you are responding, we're seeing that about 18% of you work at the primary level, and about 29% of you are at intermediate, 18 middle school, 29 high school, and 6% with college or teacher preparation. So thank you so much. It's so exciting always to see what a wide range we have when we present these webinars. So a little bit about our virtual learning networks. I just want to remind you about how these webinars come to you. This is an ASCD grant that is given to ASCD from Gates. And there are actually 4 different learning networks that are content specific. We do have, ASCD has this grant for 2 years, and so this is year 1. And each content-specific virtual learning network is hosted by a faculty member. And we do try to work together to make sure that there's some consistency among the 4 webinars and the 4 networks. Also, each webinar is recorded, and they are archived on EduCore. There's a little bit of a gap time as things are edited and cleaned up before they're posted, though. The goals of the Virtual Learning Network really aren't just webinars, though, even though that's a piece of it. Really, it's to become a community online. There is so much going on with the Common Core and getting it implemented well that we want to be able to support one another and widen our network of colleagues and people and resources in order to fully implement the Common Core. And so, through this, we do have our original convening where we were tapping people and saying, hey, what would work? What would be helpful? And then we design webinars. We are in our second of 4 webinars for this school year. And we structure each of these webinars around a problem of practice that hopefully have been identified by those who have attended or are part of the network. And then the best part, I think, about the networks, though, is this idea that we're hoping to really form some collaboration and get immediate feedback from those who are involved. And our platform, in order to be able to do that, is ASCD Edge. And if you haven't ever seen Edge, I've got a picture coming up pretty quickly here to show you. it really is a place where we can blog together, we can post resources, we can give references, we can post video, share pictures, ask questions, and respond. And I'm really hoping that we'll all get involved in that, because what an amazing tool to be able to ask a question and find out from across the country who has an idea or who's experienced something similar. So if you have not already signed up for EDGE, this is a link not to the main EDGE site, but to the groups. It's a quicker link. Now, if you've already signed up, you don't need this link. It's kind of a catch-22 here. You see, the slide will be there up on the edge, but if you aren't part of the network, you can't get to the slides anyway. So I'm pausing here to let you write that down to see what it would look like. You can go right to that link. And then if you select Q to Z, because our group name is VLN Mathematics, and you can see V falls between Q and Z. So you're going to click VLN Mathematics, and you'll ask to join. Now here's a bribe. On our math site, there is a link in the resources that'll be found over on the right-hand side where you can get your certificate of completion for attending the webinar. And so now I've really bribed you. You see you get a certificate there that says I attended the webinar, and it's worth 1 clock hour of professional development. So now everyone's going to join, I hope. This is what it looks like once you get onto our VLN. And over in the right-hand side, you'll see some resources. And I snapped this picture before the certificate was posted. But you'll see that we can all post up here in the What's on Your Mind box and post and get responses. And if you join and you become part of our VLN and you scroll down, you will see all of these posts in my little face, and it's a very lonely thing because no one's responding. So please, please, please join the conversation. Join us, get excited, ask questions, share ideas. Let's really become a virtual community. So that's the end of my pitch for joining our network. And here's a math tease. How about something to try? Play around with this for a few minutes. I always like to start our webinar time together with just something to think about. And as you look at it, it's a little bit smaller. If you can type in to the open response question area in your webinar, what answer are you getting for the question mark down there? And more importantly, how did you get your answer? And so I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, just to kind of look at it, play around with it. And what's most intriguing here is going to be, of course, how did you get there? I love doing this problem with a wide variety of people because it's often the teachers of early elementary that get it faster than the secondary teachers. And so let's just see, how did you figure it out? What answers are you getting? How many of you are thinking about, well, let's see, there's 4 tomatoes here for 28, so that's 7 per tomato. There's a start. Is that what you're doing? So how many of you were thinking, well, let's see. Oh, here's a 25. We've got one answer. Eileen, thanks for getting 25. Did everybody else get 25 also? So that's correct. 25 is our question mark. Let's talk about some different ways you could do it. Oh, there we go. So Alyssa, you've got that the apples there are 7, and the corn has to be 8. So 4 times 7 would give me 28. Then this is 14, and 14 minus this 30 would be 16, so that gets corn to 8. So both Shireen and Laura have come up with 25 for our missing value. That's great also. So how many of you got 2? Tomatoes are 7, corn is 8. So then you come down here and you say, well, that's 15, because a corn and a tomato, or a banana and an apple. It's always interesting to find out, are these bananas and apples, are they corn and tomatoes, what are they? So we'll go with the fruit version. We'll say it's a banana and an apple would be 15, and if this is 20, that means the cherry and the strawberry then would be worth 5. Yeah, okay, so we've got apples and bananas, and they're still 7 and 8 no matter what the picture is. You're absolutely right, Christiana. So as we look at the apple and the strawberry, we know that that has to be 5. Would you agree with that? So then, from here, there's a lot of different ways we could go. We can try trial and error, maybe make 1, 1 and 1, 4, see if that works, flip the value, see if that works, try 2 and 3, all kinds of different things to look at it that way. Here's one different way. I don't know if you thought of it this way, though, and say, well, if this strawberry and cherry, or strawberry and grape here, are worth 5, then these are worth 5 as well. And the banana is 8, so that would be 13, which makes this strawberry a 3. So there's a definite way I can get the strawberry as 3. And then it's a matter of going ahead and adding this column. And so with that, 7 and 7 is 14, plus 8 more is 22, plus 3 is 25. But one last thinking about this, I'm just curious if anyone thought of it this way, and that is, if you add up all of the rows, which would be like adding this column of numbers, then that sum had better equal the total columns this way. So a very quick way I could have figured this out is add 28, 30, 20, and 16 for a total of 94, and then subtract the 69 from here, and that would also give us 25. So lots of different ways to get to this problem and play around with it. I hope you enjoy our little warm-up and have your math juices running now. So into our problem of practice today, and I want to pose the question, how is it that we can help all, or at least most, of our learners with reaching the demands of the Common Core? And I have 3 ideas that I'd like to talk about today with you with that goal in mind. And the first one is one of our mathematical shifts of focus. Because truly, I think if we're going to reach all of our students well, we really do need to focus in on what do the standards actually say. So as we think about this shift of focus, we're going to look once again within all of the shifts that we've talked about, each of our convening in our last webinar. We talked about these shifts of focus, of coherence, of rigor, which is what our last webinar was over, the math practices, and being college and career ready. So today we want to really look at this idea of focus, and what does it mean to focus in on the key topics at each grade level or course within high school. So one of the big ideas with focus is that we're to go deep, not wide. And we've been very guilty of being very wide in our content year by year. So as we think about focus, we want to look again at if we have a classroom that is focused in on the content standards and the goals of the math practices, what would we see? Well, certainly we're going to see the emphasis on the content as it's described in the content standards, as opposed to unrelated activities and topics and things that we still do because we've always done them, and let's face it, they're really fun and the kids love it. Now, part of understanding what this emphasis is in the critical areas that are described at the very beginning of every grade level and also the very beginning of each conceptual area in the high school document. So this is what that looks like. This is just a random screenshot from grade 6. So going into each grade level in the content areas, content standards, or each conceptual area in the high school standards is a description, a paragraph description of what is termed the critical areas for that grade or conceptual area. It gives you a snapshot of, if nothing else, make sure this happens this year or this course. And so those are a piece of the document that would be very helpful to zero in on when I really want to think about focus. Additionally, if I'm thinking about focus, I want to make sure I'm bringing in several resources and a variety of resources as opposed to being text dependent. I want to make sure that the rigor is at the correct level for that grade level. And with that said, it's very easy to cover a topic but not really push to that depth that is described within the Common Core content standards. So we need to make sure that with the depth that we have, we need to pace that accordingly because some things are going to take more time. So we need to move away from this idea of, hey, I'm going to still use the same worksheet I've been using because it does a really good job or the same activity, even though it's not really our grade level anymore, but it's just so good I'm going to still do it. I need to move out of the mindset of I just have to get my students ready to helping them really understand and make sense of what they're learning, and absolutely move out of this coverage model. Additionally, for part of focus and moving deep is that we need to be sure that we have multiple strategies and representations for everything we're working with. Instead of this idea of there's one right way, this is the best way, and please do it this way. We want to make sure that the topics and skills are connected, that students understand why what we are doing right now follows what we've just done and will lead to what we're about to do, that it's a very deep sense of schema and connections among topics and skills, as opposed to the battle cry of topic a day or we won't finish. Another piece of going deep and really thinking about our focus is, are we presenting the math as interesting problems? Are we thinking about real-world applications and why we're learning this, as opposed to what I call naked number problems, where here's the equation, crunch the numbers, and we don't really know why, except that it's going to be tested, therefore we must do. So are we setting up the learning through a real-world challenge, through an interesting kind of intriguing, can you solve this type of problem? And by the way, here's some skills you're going to need in order to be able to do it, and that's why we work with the naked number problems. Are we going deep, or are we going wide? And then the most important piece that I think of when I look at Common Core Math today in the classroom is, are the students demonstrating those 8 math practices, or is the classroom still being dominated by teacher talk? So these are some pretty heavy-duty green and red flags as I think about focus. So let's start playing with this idea a little bit more. And I'm going to ask you to respond to the following question. And again, you're going to type in to your question box the same way you were doing before. And I'm going to ask you to think about our opening question with the fruit / veggies / whatever those little icon things were. That problem, in what ways do you think that would address this idea of focus in general and some of those green or red flags? So go ahead, take a minute and think about what you just had to do to solve that problem. And in terms of focus, what did you do to solve? And I'm looking back, and I can see that, Alyssa, you had typed in that you used a system of equations, and so certainly that would be one of the ways that we would address focus. I could use that problem with systems of equations. The warm-up was a green flag problems because there were so many multiple ways to approach it. Absolutely, Keith, thank you. There are multiple strategies that demonstrates the math practices and reasoning, and out of those box problems, critiquing arguments. You had a problem to solve and absolutely had to analyze it. So what else? There are many different green flags that you could utilize with this, says Alyssa. And there's a lot of different ways that we could ask our kids to think out of the box, but focus in on some of the math. something as easy as addition and subtraction, multiplication, division. So somewhere around 3rd grade, possibly even, they might be able to reason about this kind of a problem. And that would be some of those math practices that we're looking at. So I thank you for typing in and sharing some of your thoughts there. I have another poll question then. As we think about the green flags, which one do you think are strongest in your classroom, in your school, or in your district? So we're going to go ahead and ask you to respond. I couldn't choose all of the flags because we can only have 5 options. So you have there 5 different options on green flags. Which are the ones that you think are strongest? We have 18% that chose A, that the content emphasis is according to the standards and nothing extra is added. That 18% said it's at the correct level of rigor. The majority of you said 55% uses multiple representations. That's great. And 9% of you said that it's focused with interesting or real-world basis for learning the math. And interesting that nobody chose that we make connections among the topics and skills. So thank you so much for responding to that. That leads us to our next poll question, which I already see what's going to happen here. Probably you do too. But given that, so which ones then are the greatest needs that you see either in your classroom, your school, or your district? All right, great. So we stopped it at 60%. And here's our results. 39%, that's the largest percentage we have, chose D, that the connections among topics and skills is a weak area. The next weakest area was using interesting or real-world basis for learning the math. And then the third area was the multiple representations, even though many of you said that that was your strongest. 17% of you said, no, that's one of our weakest. So I'm interested in hearing, I've got some ideas, but I would really like to hear from you, and this is another open response. What quick tips do you have to share for any of those 3, either for interesting real-world problems, for connections among topics and skills, or for the multiple representation? So I'm going to ask you to share your thoughts and your expertise before I share mine. There we go. For interesting real-world problem, Dan Meyer's blog is a great resource. Absolutely. Dan Meyer, I love his 3 questions. If you haven't looked at those, with great video. He's got pseudo real-world problems going right now. Now, if you are an elementary teacher, his blog isn't going to be as helpful because his math tends to be more in the secondary, middle, and high school levels. But oh my gosh, what a great resource that is. Any other great ideas? Here we go. I think that the connections among topics and skills and or real-world applications go hand in hand. So doing more with connecting these 2 areas will work together. Is it Kristalina? You have a great quote. You said that one of your students said, I still hate math, but I will admit this is interesting. That's great. LearnZillion.com, there's another resource that is a great resource. Anyone else have any quick tips for any of these? So one of the things I used to do as a classroom teacher, you know how most resources will have all of the number crunching sections and then at the end they have word problems? Well, I would look at the word problems and I would choose one that I thought was so hard and so convoluted and so challenging, and I would take that problem and first of all change all the words to make it like it was mine or one of the kids in the classroom or something, and I would use that and pose it at the beginning of a unit to frame how we're going to be able to solve some really cool problems by the time we learn the math. So when I set up problems at the very beginning, it was never with a goal to solve it by the end of that day, but certainly to start asking questions about what we might need in order to solve it. And that is also partially a Dan Meyer approach, where we just reason and ask questions and wonder what we need to know. And then we create the need to learn the math. And so that's one of the connection pieces. Why do I need to learn this? Because this piece will help me get to that piece, and that piece is going to help me solve this thing. but also bringing in that real world or interesting quiz. I use a lot of games and puzzles, such as the last prompt that I showed you when we had our opener, just to kind of get them intrigued with no right answers, no way that's the correct way to do it, but just to let them play around with numeracy. And I found that goes a long way as well. So a little note pretty quickly before we leave this area of focus. If you happen to be in a park state, so you're a state that is aligned with park and is probably going to give the park test next year, park has color-coded all of the clusters in the content standards. And so green were major clusters, blue supporting clusters, and yellow as additional clusters. The idea here is not to say teach green, maybe blue, and don't worry about yellow. That is not the intent. But instead, this intent on the clustering gives you a timing that says, look, these green clusters, these are really important and you need more time on them. The yellow clusters, those are going to be developed in later years. They're transitions vertically. They don't need as much time as the green clusters do. Or perhaps they've already been taught, so it's just a touch on, you don't need as much time. So certainly if you are a park state, the framework, color coding for the clusters would be one thing that might be of help. All right. So then back to our problem of practice. How do we help reach all or at least most of our learners with the demands of the Common Core? Certainly near and dear to my heart is another idea about the students in our care. There's no way to blanket describe what to do because students are students and they're not a widget on an assembly line. They're individuals, and so really thinking deeply about those students and their needs and then what to do about them is how we sum up what differentiation is all about. And I realized as I started to think about some pieces of differentiation, I can take 3 days and still think I haven't said anything yet. So this is going to be the briefest of snapshots to give you some thoughts to get you going with the ideas of differentiation. So one big going into idea with differentiation is please don't try to reteach all the previous learning because that's never going to happen. It will never work. You won't have enough time. You'll frustrate everybody, including yourself. Instead, if you recognize that there is a very specific skill gap, what you want to do is embed the instruction of remember how to do this skill within current content. So don't take a week to remind 7th and 8th graders on how to add fractions. Remind them how to add fractions when I'm working on composite perimeters that have fractional values. So you want to embed those skills within the current content rather than stop and reteach. Another way to reach some of those gaps, of course, would be station work. So if I've pre-assessed and I know which students are missing critical information, then that can be a meet with the teacher station. So as I group my kids, I'm going to group them by what I want to work with them directly on. And perhaps one of the rotations within a station when they meet with me would be a reteaching of a missing skill, or for those top kids, it might be an extension and application beyond what the other students might be doing. And a final thought on some of these is, and we're going to go much deeper than this in just a moment, but a final thought is that very little can be truly addressed with the range of readiness in whole class instruction. So we have to rethink what does the math class structure look like and how can I work in some small group activities to better meet the needs of similar students. So that was just very briefly things that are usually burning up front, but I want to go back to the structure of differentiation and really remind you that in order to differentiate for students, it's not just about readiness. Where are they? What can they do? What can't they do? But really, it's like a three-legged stool. And if you think about sitting on a three-legged stool, if the legs are in balance, it's a fairly comfortable sit. But if one of them's too short, It might be good for my core to try to maintain balance, but honestly, it's not a very comfortable seat for very long. And heaven forbid there's a leg missing or two legs are short or whatever. And so as I look at the framework and the model of differentiation, there's really three ways by which we differentiate, and that is readiness, interest, and learning profile, the three legs of the stool. When I start, I'm going to mention interest first because usually it's the easiest one to reach. When I think about differentiating by interest, certainly it's connecting with student passions. And I remember thinking, you know, I teach high school math. I really haven't had a student come in and say, Mrs. Smith, are we going to learn slope today? Please tell me it's slope day because I've been waiting all my life for slope. You know, I just haven't had that happen. Maybe, you know, you have. I've certainly found little shades of interest that I can immediately relate into what we're learning with math. For example, a student who was passionate about Egypt, and then he was in my geometry classroom. That was awesome. So I could do all kinds of things with that passion. But a lot of times interest really is about voice and about choice. So we offer cognitive choices. We give things like, you know, here's what we've been learning. How would you like to show me? Or I need you to practice this. Would you like to do a worksheet or would you like to play a game? You choose how you want to practice. We just need to practice. What method works best for you for this solution? So really, interest differentiation, it's wonderful when I can connect with the students' interests, but it's also equally valuable to get them intrigued through those interesting problems, to ignite a spark of interest with what we're doing in math, and really just offer voice and choice. When I think about learning profile, there's all kinds of ways to do learning profile and so many different avenues that we can't possibly continue on. But here's just a list of some of the ideas, modality, the visual, auditory, kinesthetic ideas of learning. Multiple intelligences has been with us for a while. Sternberg's triarchic theory, which his research says that learners, as they learn new things, will tend to reason about it either very analytically, practically, or creatively, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment. Brain dominance, are you left-brained or right-brained or center-brained? Gender plays into it. For example, in a classroom, this is just a generalization, it's never 100% true, but in general, males tend to thrive on competition where females tend to thrive on collaboration. So if everything is for points and competition, your boys might really enjoy that, but you're going to have some girls who just don't want that stress and pressure and would much rather just be working along together. Culture is a huge piece. I've worked with several Native American cultures, and they have a very hard time standing in front of a room explaining. And at first I just wanted to force them to make those explanations. You need to talk out loud. But part of their culture it just really prevents them. And so being culture sensitive to what will be students will be able to do or not able to do, and how do we help them meet the need of being able to explain your work without having to stand in front of a room, for example. Sphere of influence, what is it that's going to make me perform well? Am I self-motivated? Am I motivated by grades? Am I motivated by my peers? Am I motivated by my parents at home? What is it that gives me that motivation to perform? And of course, temperament just is a huge part of my learning profile. So here's a very quick example, and this is a high school example. We'll look at a kindergarten example next on equations of lines from algebra, but I wanted to give you an example of the Sternberg triarchic theory. This was after we had messed around and knew very well we knew the slope-intercept form of a line, but we had to do all these other ones. And so I put my kids into 3 different groups. We did very little pre-work. We talked about forms of lines and variables and such. But basically, I just want you to see the way that these tasks were designed. Some of you elementary folks are going, oh no, please not algebra. But the analytical group did a compare and contrast of all the forms of the equations of the lines. And then they put their work into a flow chart or a table, and they had to talk about what advantages and disadvantages were, how they were alike, how they were different, hence the compare and contrast, and then how do you get to one from another. The practical group, I gave them little sleuth hats and magnifying glasses just for fun, but they had to be detectives and decide how and when each form of the equation would be best used, and what are the clues you look for to know which form to use. So what strengths and weaknesses would you pay attention to? And then you find a way, you're practical, find a way to show us. The creative group, on the other hand, they were to put the lines on trial. So within the creative group there was a defense attorney and a prosecuting attorney, and the other students took on the forms of the lines. Now they're the only group that presented this class period, and I was the judge, the rest of the students were the jury, and each form of the line would go on the witness stand. The prosecuting attorney had to prove they were redundant and not needed, and the defense attorney tried to prove that they were needed. So these were three very different approaches to really making sense of multiple forms of an equation of a line. This would be an example of a learning profile prompt where we're still working within the same content, we're still working on the same topic, we're just doing it in very different ways. Readiness, though, is the part of differentiation that probably is best known and gets the most attention. So when I think about readiness differentiation, we want to make sure we're thinking about where are the entry points, not just how do I fill holes. So for every student, if learning is a journey, where is their entry into the journey? We also want to make sure that we reach all levels, not just struggling kids. So what do we do for those students who either know it or within 5 minutes they will know it and everybody else needs 5 months? So some of the strategies there for our top kids would be compacting. I'm going to document what you already know. And instead of saying do all this and when you finish early you can do this too, which basically punishes smart kids, I'm going to say, look, I know you know how to do this, so instead of doing it, what I'm going to do is ask you to do this instead. So it might be an application, it might be a research project, but what it is an extension within topic. Scaffolding is another strategy that absolutely everybody does. How do we provide added supports on a skill or a project or any other kind of task for students who just can't get going, who don't know what to do, who bog down? So examples might be multiplication charts, word banks, samples to look at. All of those would be considered scaffolding. I use hint envelopes. Are you stuck? Pull a hint out of the hint envelope that might get you going again. And certainly with readiness, the most famous, I guess, or the best known strategy for addressing readiness would be tiered activities. And with the tiered activities, we're going to design multiple aspects. It might be 2, it might be as many as 4 versions of a task. And there's a structure called the equalizer that talks about how do we look at what to change as I'm going from task to task. That's something I can post up on our VLN site. I knew we wouldn't have time for it today. But if you are interested, I would be more than happy to go ahead and post the equalizer on our VLN site for you to see. When you're designing a tiered activity, though, so I'm going to have multiple levels, the biggest tip I can share with you would be to design from the top down. Research tells us, primarily out of the gifted and talented research, that teachers who start in the middle or who start with struggling learners and then try to push tasks up usually don't reach high enough for those really bright students. But if you start with your best and your brightest and you design a task that's going to challenge even them, and then you bring the next one down for the next group of kids, and then you look and say, can everyone reach that? If not, I'm going to design another task with a little bit more structure, a little bit more scaffolding in there, a little bit simpler. Then what happens is I challenge my top kids, but interestingly, my bottom comes up as well, and I raise the expectations for even my most struggling learners. So here's an example. This is a kindergarten counting task. The first task is find a way to count and show how many people are in our class today, and how did you get your answer? then the next task up. Now these are listed, as you can see, from simplest to most complex, but they were designed 3, 2, 1. So the second task, find a way to show how many people are in our class and how many are absent today. There's a different aspect that was added on. How many are here today and how do you know? So task 3, find a way to show how many boys are in our class today and how many boys are absent today and how many girls are here today and how many girls are absent today, and prove you are right. So you can see the number of facets per task increased. It became a little bit more abstract instead of concrete. And then the idea of explaining how you found an answer in task 1 to task 2, how do you know, and task 3, prove you're actually right. Because of time, I'm just going to show you that this one, oh, actually we have a poll question coming up, so I'm going to go ahead and have you look at this for just a moment. These are 3, and I mixed up the order, so hopefully you won't know what order is which. This is for adding fractions, and we've been working on adding fractions for a little while, and the kids came in and they were assigned to a color group. The green group were using Cuisenaire rods or fraction circles to model simple fraction addition problems. They began with common denominators and had to work up to denominators that had common multiples, such as 3 and 6. And then at the end of their practice, they made a picture book of pitfalls and hurrahs about adding fractions. The red group were using Venn diagrams to model least common multiples. And they had to explain how the process could be used to find common denominators. And they used that process to add more and more challenging problems. And then they ended up writing a manual on how to add fractions, including why common denominators were needed and 3 different ways to find it. The blue group were using manipulatives or fraction rods, fraction circles and such if they wanted them. They were available as a resource only, and they could do multiple lists if they wanted, or factor trees. And they started by rewriting fractions with common denominators and then went to adding fractions. So here's my question for you as you look at those 3. What do you think was the most challenging task to the lowest task? So again, the colors were green, where they had all the manipulatives there, and they were doing common denominators and working to common multiples. There was the red group that used Venn diagrams, and there was the blue group then that had manipulatives available if they wanted them, but they were making game instructions for explaining the rules for adding fractions. It's looking like this poll question isn't there, so we'll go ahead, and I'm just going to tell you then that this poll question, you should have chosen red was the top group because of how abstract Venn diagrams are. Blue group was the middle group. They could use manipulatives if they needed them but didn't have to. And the green group was for my most struggling. It was very concrete with all the manipulatives. So I do have a poll question. I think that's going to come up right now. Is what area of differentiation do you think your teachers use most frequently? So the largest number said readiness, and that is my experience as well, that people really try to address readiness. And I think that's a natural tendency of teachers to say, to really help those who are struggling or have gaps. The question is, are we addressing those top issues also as well with our kids, those top kids? So 53% said readiness, 27% really said few if any. And I think that happens in the crush of, oh my gosh, how do I get through this material? 13% of you said learning profile, 7% said interest. So back to our problem of practice, how can we help all or at least most of our learners reach the demands of the Common Core? Well, another idea is to really use some of these research-based strategies. And we have a book put out by ASCD. The group of us who are facilitating our virtual learning networks and our webinars have agreed to highlight these 6 strategies across the board, because these strategies, these are not math strategies. These are just solid research-based strategies that are especially effective with Common Core and the shifts of thinking that we would like all students to demonstrate. So the book is the Core 6, Essential Strategies for Achieving Excellence with the Common Core. And today we're going to look at the first two strategies, and we will feature two more on our next webinar and the final two on our last webinar. But just some tips really quickly on introducing new strategies. Make sure that you explain the purpose of the strategy and how students should interact with the strategy, not just here it is and here's what we're doing. And model and really teach them the thinking that is needed to accomplish it. Use discussion and questioning techniques to extend student thinking. And then ask them to synthesize and transfer their learning. And make sure when you're introducing and using a new strategy for the first time to leave time for students to reflect on the use of the strategy as well as the learning with the strategy. Because if they really connect with a specific strategy, then they can self-advocate and really employ those strategies independently as well. And that was very quick only because I know that the slides will be posted and you will have that information at your fingertips. So our first strategy is reading for meaning. When I first saw this, I really thought, are you kidding? This is just, more humanities and for math or, possibly science. But really, as I thought more about it, it is critical. And so often I hear, what do we do for our students who can't read and yet they have all these word problems and text that they have to read in the math program? So here's how reading for meaning basically works. You're going to identify what you want them to read. And remember, in math, that might be a word problem. It might be a piece of the text, but it could also be a graph or a table. Those are reading in math. And then as you prepare this, you're going to generate, as the teacher, a list of statements from whatever it is from the reading. Then with the students, you're going to introduce the topic and show them the statements they're about to react to. And what the students will do is record evidence about those statements either after they've read or while they're reading, and then share their evidence with a partner or whole class. So here's a quick example. Here's one word problem. During the summer vacation, your brother earns money mowing lawns. He mows 6 lawns Monday and 4 lawns Tuesday. How many lawns does he mow in those 2 days? A different problem that might be a reading, there's a graph with fruit. This time we know it's fruit. And what fruit children like. All right, so here's some statements. The first sentence contains relevant information. So I'm thinking about problem 1 there. During the summer vacation, your brother earns money mowing lawns. So what's the evidence for that statement being true, or what's the evidence against it being true? I would say the first sentence contains relevant information, not so important. What about this? To solve this problem, you need to know how much money your brother earns per lawn. Well, no, because they're not asking about earnings. They're asking about how many lawns, so I don't care how much he earns. You see how this works. What about on the graph? You don't need information about grapes. Well, what would be your evidence for would be that I don't have any information about grapes. So I would say probably not, or I won't be asked a question about grapes because there's no information. Or only 2 fruit have the same number of likes. Well, my evidence for with that one would be to say, yes, look at apples and pineapples. Those are the only 2 that have the same number of likes. How about this one? The graph does not tell us which fruits children do not like. So these are important things when I want kids to read math with meaning. And so the idea behind reading for meaning is that, before we go to that one, they're going to be able to look at what they're seeing and see what they're looking at. And can they comprehend what they're reading? And this is a great strategy to help them break down some of the texts, graphs, charts, or word problems they deal with. The second strategy out of our book is a compare and contrast. And again, originally I thought, well, this is great for other subjects. I'm not so sure about math. But as I've used this, I have become more and more convinced that this is a great way for kids to make sense and to clear up misconceptions and to powerfully connect topics and skills, as we mentioned earlier, with focus. So here's the idea behind it. What we're going to do is activate any prior knowledge. We might even give a graphic organizer and let kids take notes on it as we're giving out information. But the first step is just to get everything we have about the two things we're going to compare and contrast. In this example, I'm showing you an early elementary, addition and subtraction, but it could be area and perimeter. It could be derivatives and integrals in calculus. It could be systems of equations using different methods. It could be substitution versus elimination. So just about anything there. And you set some criteria. So in this example, I want to know, how would you define addition and subtraction? What calculations are needed? What vocabulary is important? How are they used? So at this stage, they're just thinking about each item separately. Then we move into the comparison. So there's a lot of different graphic organizers they can use. Most of us are already familiar with Venn diagrams. This one is a graphic organizer that's kind of fun, called a top hat. And you can see the first top, the part up here is the top of the hat. And so on one side, we're going to write everything we know about addition that's different than subtraction, and everything over here about subtraction that is different. And the bottom part of the top hat, we talk about their similarities. And so there's a graphic organizer that asks us to compare, contrast. But the best part of this whole structure is the conclusion, where I ask things like, do you think addition and subtraction are more alike or more different, and why? What do you think the most important difference is? What conclusions would you draw after this? And again, I have seen kids come to life and really clear up misconceptions about areas that are so often confused by just doing a compare and contrast. I'm going to go ahead and just jump into our concluding slides because our time is up in about 2 minutes. And I'm going to ask you to think about topics. And I think I've tried to put an awful lot into this problem of practice. If you have thoughts for our next webinar, which is March 28th, would you please give me some ideas? If you would like to take a single topic and really zero in depth, we can do that. If you would have a specific problem that you would like to see addressed, we can certainly do that. And I'm going to ask you again to type in to your question box and type in any of your ideas that you might like. Also, I'm going to, again, kind of beg you to join EDGE, and you can type in there on the wall. I will also post immediately what problem of practice would you like to see addressed for our next webinar. And so you will get that as well on EDGE, and I am looking for some responses from you on problems of practice. Here comes some standards of math practices. Oh, vocabulary, reading and writing within math, that would be a great topic. Open-ended tasks to show student learning, incorporating them into the classroom, incorporating standards of math practice maybe, or incorporating strategies into the classroom. Okay, so I'm going to take notes of those. The standards for math practice was our last webinar, and so I'm going to ask if you are interested in those standards for mathematical practices, to go ahead and get the archived version of that. We did quite a bit of work with our math practices last webinar, but we can look at open-ended tasks. Maybe that would even lead to assessment, that idea of showing student learning, vocab, reading and writing. Okay, so those give me a few ideas. I'm going to post it on our network as well. So I look forward to seeing you on the EDGE. Our next webinar is Friday, as I mentioned earlier, March 28th. And don't forget, go ahead, invite others. I'll be talking to you on the EDGE, and this is how you can contact me, either on the EDGE, or you can reach me at my email, nanci.smith.faculty@ascd.org. Thank you so much for taking time on your Friday afternoon, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.